Every so often, road warning signs are there. They are there because they mark a frequent danger, all right? So along these roads, they put up these markers as a warning sign because these things have happened frequently. Slipping on the road or a steep incline or a deer crossing, all right? So keeping that in mind, these are frequent things. Then why would we ever need a sign like this? That is a real sign. It's out of Washington. That's something that has happened. Town thought it would be funny. They put up the sign. The signs keep getting stolen, all right? And so they have to keep putting them up. You can order these signs now online, but is that like the craziest thing that could possibly happen while you're driving? It makes me wonder, why did that cow have a beef with that car? I may have butchered that. Sorry. Today we enter a new series of sermons that we've titled Signpost to the Cross. We are looking for signs that point to what God is up to. Now why is this needed? All through the Old Testament, God put these signs in place. That when the original hearers of these signs or readers of these signs, I doubt very much any of them pointed and said, oh, that's a verse about Jesus. In the Old Testament, they did not have that understanding. In fact, most of these signs through the Old Testament were totally missed by God's people. We're way beyond the cross. We're on the other side of the cross, and looking back now, we can begin to unpack what God has been up to since the beginning of time. And catch this. God has been moving toward you and I. Even when we were making mistakes, even when we were sinning, even when we were disobeying, God was already in the process of moving toward us. In fact, you are so important to God that long before you ever took your first breath, God a long time ago started moving in your direction. It's huge to understand. And if you want to really begin to appreciate Easter more, the way to appreciate Easter more is through the cross, and the way to understand the cross is to back up in time. It's why God gave us the Old Testament, so that we could see what he's been up to from the beginning. So what this series is all about is just unpacking some of those signs so that you see them clearly before you enter into your Easter season together. Well, one of the first signs appears in the story of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, they are part of Genesis. We're at the beginning of the Bible. Genesis 1 and 2, God creates everything. Everything is good, God says. But in the next chapter, everything falls apart. Everything that God has made, has created, he's created this perfect garden. Adam and Eve lived in this perfect garden. There was nothing contaminated at all. The rivers completely uncontaminated. You and I live in a time when waters are contaminated and you're not sure you can always drink water streams from mountains. They didn't have any of that stress. Completely uncontaminated. Uncontaminated food. The best berries, the best nuts, the best vegetables. Everything was completely perfect in the garden. And one of the things that was most exciting about Adam and Eve and their time in the Garden of Eden is that they walked with God. The Bible talks about every morning that God would come and walk with them and sit with them and talk with them. You right now have questions to God. Why kind of questions, great big questions. And if you could get that much access to God, you would just love it. Adam and Eve had that every day, and then they did the unthinkable. They disobeyed God, and they ate of the unforbidden fruit. Sometimes unbelievers will ask, why did God even put that tree in the garden to begin with? Well, God's a loving father, and just like any loving father, you got to teach your children what the word no means. God says no also sometimes to things. When our children were growing up, Bonnie didn't move all the breakables up from the bottom shelf. There were a few things left at the bottom so that while they were crawling around, they could learn the word no. They got to learn the word no. And God was also teaching Adam and Eve the word no. And so he put this tree in, and he said, you can eat of everything else. Anything in the garden you can have, but just that one tree, don't eat of it. And then along comes that serpent. That's Satan, by the way, but he's in the form of a serpent back then, and he starts tempting Eve and tempting Adam. Go ahead, eat of it. And so sure enough, Adam and Eve, they have a moment of disobeying. It's called a sin. All sin is just disobedience, you know. It might have different consequences on earth, but in God's eyes, sin is sin, period. And it just means you disobeyed him. You didn't do what he asked you to do. You didn't listen to his no. And so that becomes a sin. And usually this forbidden fruit in art is portrayed as an apple. An apple wouldn't tempt me. That goes without saying, probably. But don't kid yourself. There's forbidden fruit that could tempt. All of us in this room, you struggle with a forbidden fruit of some kind. Something that God has said no to, that the serpent, Satan, just keeps trying to get you to indulge in. Just go for it. Well, Adam and Eve, they listen to the serpent rather than listening to God, and they partake of the forbidden fruit, and this begins to affect everything. This is how our entire world becomes broken at that moment. In the Garden of Eden, there was peace, but after their sin, there's now chaos. Where there was joy, there is now sorrow. Where there was no conflict, now there's terrible conflict. Where there was no pain, now there's pain. Where there was no violence, now there is unbelievable violence. Where there was no death, now there is death. If you wonder why is the world so full of evil and so much sin and so much corruption and so much disease and so much conflict and so much hatred and so much war and so much death, it goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. They unleashed a tsunami of sin on the world. Boy, you would think God would just turn his back on them right at that moment. That's not what God does in the garden. God comes looking for them. Adam and Eve are hiding, by the way. They hear God coming. They're hiding. Adam, Eve, don't you think God knew what they had done already at that point? Of course he knew. What have you done? He asked them. He wants them to take ownership of their wrong. We ate of the tree. Oh. God knew all of that. That's the amazing grace of God inside this story, that even though he knew they messed up, he comes back to them. Now, is there discipline? Is there judgment in this story? Oh, you better believe it. Adam blames the woman for the sin. The woman blames the serpent. And God says, now because of what you've done, you've brought a curse down on the world. And he curses all three of them. He curses Adam, he gives a curse to Eve, and then he lays a curse on the serpent. It is in that curse of the serpent that we see one of our first major signposts of what God is getting ready to do. This is found in Genesis chapter 3, verses 14 through 15. So the Lord God said unto the serpent, because of what you have done, for as long as you live, you will crawl on your stomach and eat dirt. You and this woman will hate each other. Your descendants and her descendants will always be enemies. One of hers will crush your head. Oh, you will strike him on the heel, but one of her descendants will crush your head. That's where this idea of the serpent crusher comes from. That one day there's one coming. God just gave a curse on all of mankind and a curse on our planet. That's why everything is so broken. But in there's a little bit of hope that this serpent will one day be destroyed. Now, the serpent, he deals a blow. He bites one of her descendants on the heel. But ultimately, he'll destroy her. He'll destroy the serpent. So here's Adam and Eve. They're tuned in now that there's a serpent crusher coming, and it will be one of my descendants. I wonder if Eve ever wondered, I wonder if one of my boys will be that serpent crusher. Because the Bible goes right into that story next, the story of Cain and Abel. Adam and Eve, they start having children. They have lots of children, by the way, but we're only told the story of Cain and Abel. Two boys that are at odds with one another. One boy is a rancher, one boy is a farmer. Both of them been raised to give honor to God, to bring a sacrifice to God. They've been raised that way by their parents. Abel, he brings the best of his ranch. He brings a great big fatted calf. And Cain doesn't bring his best. And God rejects his offering. The Bible says that Cain was walking around after that downcast. Downcast, by the way, means bummed out. So God comes to Cain. Young Cain, why art thou bummed out? That's my own version, by the way. You're not going to read it that way. And Cain says, you know what? What are you doing? You're not accepting my offering. And it's all because it's not acceptable sacrifice. Eve hoped Cain would grow up and be the serpent crusher. He's not. Instead, he picks up a rock and he crushes the head of his brother Abel and kills him. Now, sin that started with Adam and Eve has flooded into their own family. Now, because of their poor decisions, their children are now paying because of their poor decisions. And that flood now just starts picking up speed. That tsunami of evil just picks up more and more speed. We go right into the next story, the story of Noah. By Noah's day, the world is so evil, they're conjuring up more ways to do evil things. All day long, all they are thinking about is, how can I do even more evil? They've turned on one another horribly. There's so much violence in Noah's day, which just, by the way, brings up a point. When people turn their back on God, they'll turn on one another. You tell me if that's not a description of our world today. When people turn their back on God, they eventually start turning on one another. Husband will turn on wife, and wife will turn on her husband, and kids will turn on their parents, and neighbor against neighbor, and it just starts happening. And this is what's going on in Noah's day. God says, that's it. I've had enough. I'm going to cleanse the whole earth. I'm washing it all away. He gets this idea of a flood. Although one family is righteous, one family, they're not perfect, but they are more righteous than the rest of the world around them. So God goes to Noah and he says, build an ark. It will save you and your family. If you're found in the ark, you'll be saved. I also want you to gather together 2 of every kind of animal and put them in the ark. You know, I think Noah missed an opportunity to rid our world of a few bad animals at that point. Can I just say that? You know, skunks and rats and snakes. I got a phobia against snakes. I don't do well with snakes. What a great chance he would have had. If I'd have been Noah and those snakes come slithering up the ramp, I'd have been, whoa, whoa, whoa. Where do you think you're going? But we have an invitation. I don't think so. You're out of here. And I just been run. And it could not have been easy to be on the ark. Oh, my goodness, you know. Boys, where'd you put the lions? It's okay, Dad. They're right downstairs next to the gazelles. You know. Goes down to the lions. Listen, you two. When this whole thing's over, there better still be 2 gazelles. You know, which might explain where unicorns went. It's just a thought. You know, unbelievers don't even believe these 3 stories. They don't believe the Adam and Eve story. They don't believe the Cain and Abel story. They don't believe the Noah's Ark story. They say it's because of science. Science can be answered. All their questions have a good answer, by the way. The proofs are out there. What they really don't like about these stories is God's judgment. God finally loses his patience. God is described as a patient God. He's been patient with all of us, but once in a while his patience runs out, and he allows his discipline to come into your life. It happened to me. It happens to you. The world is a mess now. God didn't want his world to go bad, but it did. At the beginning it was good, but it just spun out of control. And we live in a broken world right now. You and I in a broken world. What can help us? Not only what can help our broken world, what can help my brokenness? I'm also a sinner, and you're a sinner. I've made mistakes, you've made mistakes. We all struggle with our forbidden fruit. What can help our brokenness? Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, we told our kids. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses, all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Whoever wrote that nursery rhyme, what did he really expect the horses to do? I'm unsure, but here's this broken Humpty. Maybe the king would come down. The king's horses and the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again, but what happens if the king comes down? Oh, that changes everything. And the King of Heaven has come down. His name is Jesus. This was God moving toward you again in his son Jesus. In fact, he's not only referred to as the king throughout the Bible, there's a few times he's referred to as the King of Kings. He comes down and he takes on the serpent. In the book of Revelation, there's this great battle between Jesus and the serpent. It's actually the dragon in the book of Revelation. It keeps talking about this battle with the dragon. But it also says the dragon, that serpent of old. So you know who the dragon is. It's the devil. Jesus comes down and he battles with him. Oh, sure, the serpent took a chunk out of Jesus' heel. He caused his death and caused him to go to the cross. And Satan thought he had won. But 3 days later, Jesus comes back from the dead and proves he didn't win. And eventually, one day, Jesus does away with all evil all at one time, and he crushes that serpent's head. It's coming. You and I, we get to choose today. Are we going to be on the side of Jesus or on the side of the serpent? We get to make that choice. God knew that you would make mistakes. God knew that we would sin. God knew that I wouldn't always obey him. That's why God knew that we'd need a second chance and a third chance and a fourth chance and a 490th chance. God knew that. So a long, long time ago, thousands of years ago, he started making plans to move toward you. And he said, one day, this serpent crusher's coming. Make sure you're on the right side. Listen, this morning, if you want to have a bad life, just start stringing together a series of bad decisions. One bad decision might not wreck your life. Two bad decisions might, but a series of bad decisions will lead you to a bad life. However, just the opposite is true. You can start having a better life right now by starting to string together a series of wise decisions. One wise decision won't put everything back together, but you know what? You make a wise decision today, and tomorrow you make another wise decision, and then you make another, and you start stringing together enough wise decisions, and your life gets better. Out of all the wise decisions you need to make today, the wisest of them all is to allow Jesus into your life. You and I don't have the power to crush the serpent. He does. You and I don't have the power to defeat temptation and sin. He does. Today, the wisest move you can make is to say, you know what? I need a little more Jesus. Today, you walked into church. Wise decision. Tomorrow morning, you're going to get another option to choose which side you're going to be on. Will you get up in the morning and tell Jesus, I want to be on your side, or are you going to choose a different side? Just start stringing together wise decisions. Adam and Eve, terrible decision. Cain and Abel, terrible decision. Noah's people of Noah's time, terrible decisions. And they wrecked their lives. But one day, here comes the serpent crusher.